Hi, I'm Dr. Sharad Paul. I'm the author of Genetics of Health and a skin doctor. Today I'm going to be talking about vitamin C for skin and health. One of the major philosophies in medicine and skin care is I've often said that you cannot have bad health and good skin. Skin just reflects what's going on underneath. So why am I holding an orange today? Because we all know that oranges are citrus and citrus fruits contain vitamin C. In fact, this medium-sized orange contains about 70 milligrams of vitamin C, which is about the daily requirement for a female. For an average male, it's about 90 milligrams. If you look at certain other fruits, like green peppers would have even twice that amount, and yellow peppers have even more. So like capsicum, your yellow capsicum would have much more vitamin C than orange, about 3 times. And you may have black currants at another source. So we have many other fruits which are very rich in vitamin C. Now, one of the interesting things when I was researching for the Genetics of Health, which has a chapter on eating for your gene type, is that some people may need more vitamin C than others, and I'm going to explain why that happens. So to understand that, first of all, we need to understand a little bit about the genetics. Now, as a human being, if we think about how many genes we have, it takes us back to the Human Genome Project. See, the original study was in a worm called the C. elegans, which had about 19,000 genes, and they were studying these worms for longevity, because these worms are fairly transparent, the C. elegans, so people can literally see through them, so we can study their genes. So if a worm had 19,000 genes, people thought that human beings would have 300,000 genes. Guess what? We have about 25,000 genes. If you ask me how many genes does this orange contain, and if I asked you, you would guess maybe 5,000. The orange has about 29,000 genes. It actually has more genes than I do. And a cabbage has over 50,000 genes. It's crazy, right? But a lot of these vegetables and things, they're actually buried under the ground. They need a lot of processes and proteins to eliminate other viruses and fungi and things which grow on them. So they tend to actually have more genes than we do. Now, what's interesting when it comes to vitamin C is it also has a history of actually being part of the first ever human clinical trial or a control experiment. So this was done by James Lind, sailor, or actually a naval officer aboard the HMS Salisbury in 1747. So this was during the time of the War of Austrian Succession, where Britain was at war with France and Spain. And what happened was, prior to the Salisbury sailing, George Anson became Lord Anson, was the admiral of the fleet, and he had noted on his voyages that about a third of seamen had died because of a mysterious illness. And in fact, this illness had been considered a sailor's curse even previously. So in 1497 or 98, when Vasco da Gama was sailing to India, he had a crew of 160, of which 60 of them perished. They developed bleeding gums, sores all over their bodies, their mouth ulcers, and they looked terrible, and people thought they were cursed by a spirit. People didn't realize that it was to do for lack of vitamin C. So George Anson had mentioned to James Lind that on his crew he had lost a third of seamen, and James Lind on this voyage on the HMS Salisbury noticed that about 80 out of the 350 crew fell ill within about 8 weeks of departure. So he decided to run a controlled clinical trial. Suspecting that it may have something to do with the diet, he divided the men into 6 different groups. He had oranges and lemons in one group, vinegar and vitriol. Other group he had nutmeg and seawater. So it was a 6-armed controlled trial. And what was interesting, at the end of the experiment, only the men who were eating the citrus, the oranges and lemons, didn't fall ill, or they recovered. So what they realized is it had to do with his diet, and it was the first time he proved that something in these oranges and lemons was what was preventing disease in these men. So this in fact he wrote a treatise on what the disease was called scurvy, because it caused mouth ulcers. It derived from the Danish word scorby, and it actually caused severe illnesses in various organs of the body, because vitamin C is really your ultimate antioxidant. After James Lind's trial, actually it became compulsory. At least all ships were advised to carry the supply of limes, and to the degree that all the British naval ships carried boxes and boxes of limes. In fact, other countries at that point laughed at them, to the point that the American sailors, for example, called the British ships limeys because they thought they were carrying limes. They didn't realize that it was actually the first part of preventative medicine. So now when I was researching for my book, The Genetics of Health, if you take genes to the next level and you apply individual personalized genomics, we know that vitamin C metabolism is impacted by a gene called GSTT1. Stands for glutathione S transferase theta 1. So people who have the two variants, obviously an insertion variant where the gene is inserted as a normal variant. Some people have a deletion variant where part of the gene is deleted. So in people with the normal INS variant, you just metabolize vitamin C properly. So your normal dietary intake of vitamin C should be sufficient. But for people who have the deletion variant, they actually need to double their source of vitamin C because they absorb it inefficiently. So this is crazy. So a certain proportion of us actually will have this gene, which means that we have to consume more than average vitamin C. What happens if you don't? So this was a study done in Canadian students over years, and they basically identified people who had the deletion variant of the gene, and they observed what happened to them. And over each year, blood pressure went up, they gained a bit of weight, they gained abdominal circumference, their inflammatory markers like CRP and others also went up. In other words, over time, your risk of heart disease, blood pressure, obesity, and inflammatory diseases went up. It really showed the importance of vitamin C, but also the importance of personalized healthcare. And if you're more interested, you can really read my book, The Genetics of Health, or you can just go to geneticsofhealth.com and order your own gene test. But speaking of vitamin C and skin, we all know that vitamin C is so important for skin because there's so many vitamin C serums out there. So how does vitamin C actually impact skin? To do this, we need to understand again not only its role as an antioxidant, but a little bit of the skin structure. So the topmost outermost layer of skin is called the stratum corneum, which is actually the horny layer because it's actually very rougher cells, and they're little flattened cells which lack nuclei. So in the beginning, people actually thought the top layer of skin is actually dead. That's why it sheds, because we don't have any nuclei. But in actual fact, it's a very clever way of our bodies designing themselves. The reason we lack the nuclei is because we cannot get the DNA damage from our environmental toxins that easily. The layer below the stratum corneum is the granular layer, or the stratum granulosum, where we actually produce different proteins which are beneficial for skin. So the two particular ones are, one, we produce the lipid lamellae, which are really the fatty kind of cells. And what this happens is, if you think about it, skin cells are like bricks, and this fatty layer forms like the mortar around the bricks, and it holds it together. And this also forms the barrier, so stops the skin from being leaky. Now there are other proteins, and there was a protein which was discovered called filaggrin, which is something I'm going to talk about now because it is quite important. In 1977, Beverly Dale discovered a protein called filaggrin, and filaggrin stands for filament aggregating protein. And then about in 2006, Professor Irwin McLean of Dundee really found that this filaggrin was impacted in eczema and skin diseases where your skin becomes leaky. So the reason why these filaments are important is, if you think about, like I said, you have skin cells like bricks, you got the fatty layer around it, and those are what are your ceramides, which is what you would have heard of, ceramides and moisturizers. And then you have filaments, which are basically like a scaffolding which holds up your cells. And what's interesting is, when you have this scaffolding which is holding up your cells, the more and more filaments you produce, eventually, just like, I suppose if you got an ironing board up and you got all the filaments up, after a while it flattens out. So it flattens by sheer weight, and that's why the top layer of skin becomes flattened out and becomes a nice flatter layer. And what was interesting is, when these filaments flatten the cells out, they actually give you a nice barrier, and then the lipid cells give you a good coating. So overall, our skin becomes a healthy barrier. Just like healthy gut, increasingly now we understand gut can get leaky, and in a similar way the skin can get leaky. So if you don't have an optimal membrane, then you develop leaky skin, and then you end up with diseases like eczema. Now, where does vitamin C come into all this? Now, the interesting thing with this filaggrin is a chromatophore. In other words, it attracts light photons. So let's say you're out in the sun. I'm in a bit of sun now. It's not too sunny, but if you have sun on your skin, the UV rays target the filaggrin because it's a chromatophore, and they break it down. And this filaggrin then gets broken down into things like pyrrolidine carboxylase, amino acids, uric acid, urocanic acid, and lactic acid. Now what's interesting is, this urocanic acid is particularly important because the main byproduct of this filaggrin breakdown was trans-urocanic acid, and that is also chromatophore. So basically, the sun's rays targeted. So for a while actually research was done, because that trans version of this trans-urocanic acid then becomes cis-urocanic acid, and for a while people thought that because it was absorbing the energy, it could actually be a natural sunscreen. So actually about 15 to 20 years ago, people started studying incorporating urocanic acid into sunscreens to see if that would benefit. But unfortunately it didn't pan out, because that conversion actually leads to some immunosuppression in the cells because of sun damage, and we now know that sun also damages our DNA. But what we know about vitamin C is when we have UVB, especially the UVB rays, the rays which burn our skin, hit our skin, we cause both DNA damage, we cause redness, and we cause a sunburn. Vitamin C or ascorbic acid reduces the erythema, the redness, by 50%, and reduces further DNA damage that can occur by another 50%. So in other words, both the burning reaction as well as the damage can be reduced by vitamin C, because it's an ultimate antioxidant. So therefore vitamin C is really important for skin, and in further episodes I'll be talking about what are the specific types of vitamin C, what are the types of serums you should be using. But I think for today we've spoken enough about vitamin C, and then do follow these episodes. Feel free to ask questions, and see you next time.